This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to Dr. No, which is widely available in most places and may already be up on Prime as part of the Amazon acquisition of MGM. This is a pre-taped episode while Dana and I are on vacation, but we are doing the next few weeks on James Bond movies to look forward to the release of the last Daniel Craig James Bond film that's been delayed since November 2019, No Time to Die, coming to theaters on October 8th, 2021. So we have Dr. No this week, Live and Let Die, Roger Moore's first appearance, and Casino Royale, Daniel Craig's first appearance over the next few weeks. However, quickly before we get to the show, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes, you can subscribe at the bottom of every page, or you can also email us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. And, as always, please like, follow, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you use. With that, Dad, we covered Goldfinger last year after we lost Sir Sean Connery, and we returned tonight for Dr. No. What's your relationship to this movie, this series, and why do we both always look forward to covering these movies every time?
Well, I remember as a kid watching Goldfinger with my dad when I was on network TV, and I must have been about 8 or 9, and to see a woman who was semi-nude laying on a bed covered in gold was quite eye-opening for a 9-year-old.
And they really let you get away with a lot of stuff.
My parents?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I used to watch a lot of stuff that when I look at it back now, I would never have allowed you guys to watch. Laugh-In, for example. The only thing I can say is that probably at that time I didn't understand the jokes. But anyway, James Bond, I remember watching it and seeing that, and you know, she was covered because she was laying face down, but still, you knew. And it was quite titillating, pun intended.
I certainly have some very fond, I don't know if I would call them childhood, but adolescent memories of watching these movies for the first time. And I know most people really relate to whichever Bond was their Bond when they were growing up. So a lot of people have affinity for Roger Moore or for Pierce Brosnan or whatever. And some people just haven't experienced the full Sean Connery 60s original Bonds. But those are the ones, oddly enough, I grew up on because those were the first ones I actually saw. I remember watching these, and I think I told this on our Goldfinger episode, that I was over at my grandparents' house for a week or something when I was like 12 during the summer, and we went to the library, and I think it was Dr. No, Goldfinger, and Diamonds Are Forever. And Diamonds Are Forever is, oddly enough, probably my favorite Bond film because it was the first one I watched. I don't know, it's so quirky and campy and has so much more to offer than most of the other Connery films as far as stunts and other stuff going on that I just seem to always gravitate toward that one as kind of a low-grade classic for me. I know that's not the popular opinion. Most people say, Goldfinger or Dr. No or, some of these other ones, but for me, that one was always a favorite. Why this series relates so much, it's just got a certain aura of what the male fantasy is. The fast cars, fast women, saving the day, always winning in the end, the action hero that never gets his suit wrinkled, that type of thing. And so, plus, you kind of grow up with certain franchises, and for at least me, this has always been a part of that.
James Bond and Henry Winkler as the Fonz. The two guys who could basically and get a woman on their shoulder. It, to me, was the epitome of everything I only wished I was.
So, let's get into the movie itself. I don't want to prolong our Bond affection more than we probably already have when we did the Goldfinger episode. But do you have your plot summary ready?
I do. Intelligence officer James Bond is sent to investigate the disappearance of a station chief in Kingston, Jamaica, in connection with the rocket toppling investigation already underway. Bond ends up teaming with local fisherman Quarrel, played by John Kitzmiller, and his CIA counterpart Felix Leiter, played by Jack Lord from Hawaii Five-O fame. They soon realize that the mysterious crab key and its owner, Dr. No, Joseph Wiseman, will hold all the keys. After Bond and Quarrel make their way to Crab Key, they stumble across an unwilling partner in Honey Ryder, played by Ursula Andress, and are soon captured by Dr. No, only for him to confess his plan to destroy the U.S. space program. Bond must make a daring escape to stop Dr. No and Spectre.
Excellent. All right, cast for this movie. As you mentioned a few of these already, Sean Connery as James Bond, Ursula Andress as Honey Ryder. Andress's spoken dialogue was dubbed by Nikki Vanderzil, and her singing voice was dubbed by Diana Coupland. They were both uncredited. Joseph Wiseman as Dr. Julius No, Jack Lord as Felix Leiter, Bernard Lee as M, John Kitzmiller as Quarrel, Anthony Dawson as Professor R.J. Dent, Zena Marshall as Miss Tarot, Eunice Gayson as Sylvia Trench. Gayson's voice was also dubbed by Nikki Vanderzil, Lois Maxwell as Miss Moneypenny, and Peter Burton as Major Boothroyd, the head of Q Branch. This was Burton's only appearance as Q. Recognition for the film. In 1999, it was ranked number 41 on the BFI Top 100 British Films list compiled by the British Film Institute. The 2005 American Film Institute's 100 Years series also recognized the character of James Bond himself in the film as the third greatest film hero. Bond was also placed at number 11 on a similar list by Empire, and Premiere also listed Bond as the fifth greatest movie character of all time. Following the release of Dr. No, the quote, Bond, James Bond, became a catchphrase that entered the lexicon of Western popular culture. Writers Cork and Schiavelli said of the introduction in Dr. No that the signature introduction would become the most famous and loved film line ever. In 2001, it was voted as the best loved one liner in cinema by British cinemagoers. In 2005, it was honored as the 22nd greatest quotation in cinema history by the American Film Institute as part of their 100 Years series. Dr. No was the first of 25 James Bond films produced by Eon, which have grossed just over $5 billion in box office returns alone, making the series one of the highest grossing ever. It is estimated that since Dr. No, a quarter of the world's population have seen at least one James Bond film. Dr. No also launched a successful genre of secret agent films that flourished in the 1960s. The UK Film Distributors Association have stated that the importance of Dr. No to the British film industry cannot be overstated, as it and the subsequent Bond series of films form the backbone of the industry. The film influenced ladies' fashion as well, with the bikini worn by Ursula Andress proving to be a huge hit. Quote, not only sent sales of two-piece swimwear skyrocketing, it also made Andress an international celebrity, end quote. Andress herself acknowledged that the bikini made me into a success. As a result of starring in Dr. No as the first Bond girl, I was given the freedom to take my pick of future roles and to become financially independent. It has been claimed that the use of the swimwear in Dr. No led to the, quote, the biggest impact on the history of the bikini. Did you know? Contrary to popular belief, Sir Sean Connery was not wearing a hairpiece in his first two outings as James Bond. Although he was already balding by the time Dr. No was in production, he still had a decent amount of hair, and the filmmakers used varying techniques to make the most of what was left. By the time of Goldfinger 1964, Connery's hair was too thin, and so various toupees were used for his last Bond outings. Maurice Binder designed the gun barrel opening at the last minute by pointing a pinhole camera through a real gun barrel. The actor in the sequence is not Sir Sean Connery, but stuntman Bob Simmons. Connery didn't film the sequence until Thunderball 1965. Did you know? This was chosen to be the inaugural movie in the James Bond film franchise, as the plot of the source novel was the most straightforward. It only had one major location, Jamaica, and only one big special effects set piece. Did you know? Sir Sean Connery was morbidly afraid of spiders. The shot of the spider in his bed was done with a sheet of glass between him and the spider, which can be seen in one shot in the movie. When this didn't look realistic enough, additional close-up scenes were reshot with stuntman Bob Simmons. Simmons reported that the tarantula crawling over Bond was the scariest stunt he had ever performed. According to Stephen J. Rubin's 1981 book, The James Bond Films, this tarantula was named Rosie. Did you know? A Francisco de Goya, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, painting of the Duke of Wellington, stolen in August 1961 from London's National Gallery, is found on an easel next to the stairs in Dr. No's dining area, which is why Bond stops to notice it as he passes it while going up the stairs. It was recovered in 1965. When this movie first came out, British audiences laughed upon seeing the Goya, knowing it had been stolen. According to director Terence Young, the idea for the stolen painting prop came from the film's Irish co screenwriter, Joanna Hardwood. Did you know? After viewing this movie, James Bond creator Ian Fleming reportedly described it as being, quote, dreadful, simply dreadful, end quote. Did you know? It is long-standing misconception that John Barry wrote the James Bond theme. It actually originated from a song, Good Sign, Bad Sign, composed by Monty Norman, from an aborted musical, The House of Mr. Biswas. Barry arranged and orchestrated Norman's theme to produce the theme as it is known throughout the world. Did you know? Ian Fleming didn't originally like the casting of Sean Connery as James Bond. Bond was English and Connery was Scottish. Bond was from an upper class background and Connery came from a working class background. Bond was refined and educated and Connery was too rugged. After seeing this movie, however, Fleming softened and decided that Connery was perfectly cast. In the novel, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Bond was revealed to have Scottish ancestry, and Bond's girlfriend, Teresa Tracy Vincenzo, was described with Ursula Andress's details. Did you know? The first scene Sean Connery filmed as James Bond is the sequence in the Kingston airport where he passes a female photographer and holds his hat up in front of his face. The filming date was January 16th, 1962. Will be coming up on the 60th anniversary next January. With that, what is this movie about, and how would you describe the elevator pitch?
A spy thriller written by an ex spy.
I should basically just readopt this for each Bond movie we do, but smooth British spy travels to exotic location and saves Western geopolitics from a madman.
Well, you have to understand, there really was an MI6 at one point in time, and everybody in MI6 was highly educated, sophisticated, independently wealthy. So they didn't need to have money from the government because they could pay their own way for a lot of things. So there was never any questions asked about Parliament as to what they were doing. And they usually were orphans. So there wasn't any family around to question. So there was only a handful of these guys. Ian Fleming happened to be one of them, or at least knew of them. He may have been MI5 as opposed to 6, but he was familiar with them. So that's basically his version of what took place.
Certainly. Best performance, Connery.
Without a doubt.
He really does make the film and make the character, even from the first outing. And you really get it from that first scene, which I'm going to nominate here in a few minutes. But the card club, you just see that way he carries himself and the certain confidence with which he exudes almost every pore of James Bond.
Yes. A while ago, I think maybe like 10 years ago, I came up with this concept of asking guys, I'm going to ask you a question. Who is the coolest man in the world? You may give me an answer. And if I tell you who it is, you're going to pause and go, no, you're right. And I would always say that I'd get answers like,
Clooney, DiCaprio.
yeah. And then I'd say, no, Sean Connery. Oh, yeah, you're right. And this is what made Sean Connery into an international star and basically allowed him to dictate whatever he did for movies and stage work for the rest of his life.
Pretty much. I mean, even in some of his later roles, he just still has this certain intangible quality of this aura of confidence that you just can't completely describe. But even with the writing and as utterly campy as it would be out of almost anyone else's mouth, for some reason, every one of these smooth lines that Connery delivers, he does it in such a silky way that it seems appealing. All right, so let's move past that. I found it actually very difficult to come up with a great secondary performer because every time I thought, all right, maybe, no, not quite. So I feel like I'm doing this almost out of default, and I thought maybe they should be recognized because I don't think they'll get their due otherwise. But Harry Saltzman and Albert R. Broccoli were my best secondary performers because they got this thing up off the ground. The Broccoli family still controls the major components of the Bond series and the Bond franchise and have creative control and discretion over basically anything that happens. But it's like I'm trying to think. It's like a legacy project, like the family business, the like having a family law firm or I don't know, a family restaurant that it just you have to maintain a certain level of quality and certain things have to always be in every Bond film. And while this is not the complete Bond formula, I think we got the full Bond formula by the time we get to Goldfinger. You're getting certain elements put together. The theme song, the opening theme sequence, the gun barrel thing that became a part of almost every Bond film. Certain little things that eventually became staples for every part of the Bond film. And so I think at least to just give them some level of recognition, they were my secondary performers.
And the only comment I would make about that statement is what happened during the Timothy Dalton years.
They ran into some of the same problem they had with Roger Moore. They originally wanted to get Pierce Brosnan, but he was tied up with Remington Steele, so they had to go with Timothy Dalton, and he was terrible.
Anyway, my best secondary performance, and I'll explain it, was Ursula Andress. She set the standard for what a Bond girl was going to be, and everybody had to measure up against her throughout the next films.
I suppose, and I thought about giving it to her only for the fact that A, she's only in half the movie, and B, all of her stuff was dubbed, which undercuts it a bit. Like, not even her speaking voice was just her. And I know she's basically on screen to look good.
Well, of course. You know, you think of right at the time she did this film, she was an international model. Right, so that's one of the reasons why they recruited her. She was married to the actor, soon to become director, John Derek. John Derek divorced Ursula Andress to marry Linda Evans, and then divorced Linda Evans to end up with Bo Derek. So I don't know what John Derek had, but it had to be Bondesque.
I really don't want to get into that conversation.
Okay, fine.
Anyway, no, I can take your point. Most charismatic. There's the Sean Connery Award, and then there's everyone else.
Well, of course.
So let's just get that out of the way. Connery wins this going away. But if you had to pick somebody non Connery, who do you go with?
Actually, I thought Jack Lord had a certain charisma, and you could see why Jack Lord, one of the most successful and long-lasting television shows in American TV history, was the original Hawaii Five O, and Jack Lord starred in that, and it had a huge following. It was consistently within the top 20 of television for like 12 or 13 years. To that extent, if you're talking about charisma, it's clear to me to see that Jack Lord had a certain element about him that made people like him, that thought he was a kind of a gritty, honest player.
Yeah, you certainly don't see him as too much of a hard ass, but you understand his sternness and automatically give a certain layer of respect to it. He just has like maybe it's in the tenor of his voice. He commands a certain level of attention and respect just from that.
Did you have anybody for that?
Yeah, I did. John Kitzmiller. I've always liked the Quarrel character, and that's actually going to come back around in my remaining questions. But I think it's actually a very distinct character that's memorable. Why they eventually, in the movie we're supposed to be doing next week, have to come up with a Quarrel Jr. for that particular movie. So it's kind of a one-off character, but I really wish this would have been one that, given the amount of Caribbean adventures that Bond has, that this would have been more of a recurring character like the Felix Leiter character. Especially because I like John Kitzmiller in this role.
Well, but you have to understand, Ian Fleming wrote the first couple, and he had no idea they were going to be successful. And in fact, they weren't very successful. What made Ian Fleming's book successful is that Life magazine did an interview with the incoming president, John F. Kennedy, in 1960, December of 60, or maybe it was January of 61. And they asked him, you have a long, hard, tough day. What do you do to relax? And he said, oh, I found these novels by this guy named Ian Fleming. They're really fun. And I can sit and I just read these for about an hour before bed, and I can relax and go to sleep. The minute that happened, Ian Fleming's novels went from being almost no sales to being like New York Times bestsellers.
That's a little overstatement. They were still not successful until the movies came out.
Okay, so I'm a little hyperbole.
Sure. Even so, it is notable in the history of how this came to be because the movies would not have been made without that. All right, so I already said my first nominee up for best scene is Cards at the Club. And again, this is the perfect introduction of James Bond. If you could take nothing else away from Dr. No, I think it would be this particular sequence. You have this mysterious figure who's at the card table. They're looking for him. If you've never seen this before, you're not even necessarily looking for Connery himself, but anybody who's watched this scene multiple times knows exactly what's coming. But it's the essence, his, again, the confidence in Bond, James Bond. And that's how he's just introduced and interjected into everything that's going on. And he makes attractive women swoon. And, my number's
Uh,
on the card. Just very small things. Is this, or are these the only types of games you like to play, Miss Trench? Just all those little subtleties that you don't necessarily pick up on the first, second, or third time viewing, but just he breathes James Bond into life, and it's this scene.
Agreed. I mean, it is everything from the tuxedo to the interplay with the other card players. And it's clear that he has a certain quality that will transcend the scene and will permeate through the rest of the film.
Absolutely. So, what's your first nominee?
I love the beach scene with Honey. Under the mango tree. She's singing, he's singing. I mean, it's basically Bond romancing a girl he just met while he's also undertaking a mission. It so foreshadows all the future Bond relationships and how they all interplay that I just think that it's a perfect scene to show his ability, or a ladies' man. I almost said a womanizer, but we'll get to that regarding some of the scoring later. A ladies' man and a secret agent at the same time.
I don't know. I had it down because I think it's a classic scene in the history of Bond. I just don't find it necessarily to be particularly memorable, other than the first appearance of the Bond girl type of thing.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not nearly as shocking when you can see that anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess it's more anecdotal, but it just doesn't have the impact that it did for me in 2002 that it had for people in 1962. But I had a couple of scenes in between then, so I'll go ahead and take those out. But the airport, I liked the pacing of all of that because of the international travel and how he would arrive, and there are people already watching him and snooping him out at the airport, and then he's got to take on the chauffeur and all of that sequencing, and in between the phone booth and the photographer. It just is a really well paced scene that plays out very cinematically, and it doesn't feel forced, but it played against the music that they did for the theme on that one. I just thought it played out very well.
I agree. I had that scene down as well. I thought that, I mean, you have to go back a little bit. Now, you have so much information about individuals at your fingertips or your keyboard. Back then, you had to do some actual research. You had to spy. You kind of had to go a little bit much more involved to pull up information in order to be able to do the general idea of what was spying at the time.
The next one then I had down was the car chase, and not the one with the chauffeur, but rather the one where he finally takes out the three blind men assassins. And it's notable to me only in how poorly staged it is. Like, even in the few years that it takes to get to some of the other car chases and then the eventual boat chase in Live and Let Die, and you see how different it is for action movies by comparison to Sean Connery, who's clearly overdriving the car with a bad canvas screen behind him, being chased by these guys. It was such a campy scene, but it's still the first big chase scene in a Bond movie. And so, from that standpoint, it's notable. All right, the next one then I had before I got to the beach scene was getting the drop on Dent. And it's, I guess, the sequence. Yeah, you can maybe draw it out and say how he gets the drop on, I guess it's Miss Tarot, the secretary before that. But realistically, I just really am going to focus it on that last part where Dent comes into the bedroom, fires off his six shots, and basically is cornered by Bond, who's somehow made connection that Dent is going to come and try and assassinate him, but he ends up killing him. And the way that plays out and staring down your opponent and the kind of I've checkmated you, it's time that you either give me what I need or you're going to die type of situation. Because realistically, I think it's the first person that Bond kills on screen. Do you have any others yet?
The tarantula scene.
Okay, so I did move over that one, but why do you nominate that one?
It's kind of iconic. The one thing you can honestly say is that every film has some bizarre, over the top method for trying to kill Bond. We have a laser in Goldfinger, we have a tarantula in Dr. No. I mean, it's always something. You know, they made a big joke of it in the Austin Powers series. Why don't you just shoot him? You want to kill him? Just shoot him. You've got a gun.
You think that the elaborate ways that they go to try and kill Bond are bad now. Live and Let Die has at least two major set pieces like that for next week. And I agree with you. That just shoot him.
The old adage is if you could do something simply, why would you want to do it in a more complicated way?
I guess it makes for better cinematic quality. I don't know.
I guess gives Bond an opportunity to escape over and over and over.
I will say for this particular movie, that is probably one of the more thrilling scenes of the movie because you kind of feel the spider almost creeping up your own arm, at least the first few times you watch it. So there is some sort of sympathy that you can have in watching that scene. All right, then I had Doctor No. So this is the dinner play with them and describing it, the first mentions of Spectre, and I guess anytime you get one of those montages or those mashups of all of the Bond film franchise, the first time Dr. No appears is always somewhere in that larger video montage. But I don't know. It's another one of these iconic scenes, and I'm not really sure why. The repartee of Bond meeting the villain for the first time and trying to feel each other out like a somehow a boxing match, it feels a little flat by comparison to some of the other ones he eventually has, but just me.
Well, of course it feels flat because you know there's going to be 25 additional movies. So it's not like Bond's going to actually end up in some disadvantage of this.
I'm not even so talking as much as that, but Dr. No never really feels fully threatening. He's not the level of danger as like Gert Frobe in Goldfinger
Well,
or
yes. I mean, they got the lines better. No, Mr. Bond, I intend for you to die. The lines were better.
anyway, the only other one I had was the final battle at Escape, and that's kind of all treated as one thing. So, again, I don't find this to be one of the better Bond movies. It sets the stage for a lot of other ones, but I think there are better ones in the series.
Of course. But the first sets the stage and basically lays the foundation. You never look when you're building a building at the cornerstone. You look at the building in total. So this is the cornerstone.
I guess, and if you look at it, the totality of 25, 26 films, I still wonder. I don't know. You expect sometimes the first one to also be one of the better ones. I just don't always get that from this film because it seems very plain that there's not a lot of budgeting. And I don't know. Even if you go to From Russia with Love, I find it to be a much better movie. But anyway, favorite scene.
My favorite scene is the beach scene. I think the beach scene kind of sets the whole foundation of what Bond is, and the Bond girls, and the relationship, and the exotic location. And it kind of lets you into the inside aspect of the Bond. I don't think, and there's a reason why James Bond films were always popular in Playboy magazine in the 60s. The same basic mentality went for people who loved Bond as who were key card holders and such. They had this fascination with a lifestyle that was beyond the norm. And that scene to me opens that whole avenue of what this exotic life that this guy is leading and how every guy would love to be James Bond.
My favorite one was the card club at the beginning. Again, I think that's the quintessential scene from this movie because it's the first introduction of the character and they do it so smoothly. Indelible moment, though, I'll take it from the same scene. It's Bond, James Bond. That's the moment.
Of course, it's clear. I mean, it becomes the epitome of every. In fact, I'd have to go back and through, but I think all 25 at some point there's a scene where they say there's an introduction. Bond, James Bond.
I don't think it's in every one, but it's in a lot of them. I'd say about 2/3 at least.
I'm gonna go back through and start watching them and look for it because I think it's in every one.
You do that because I can guarantee you it's not.
Okay.
Anyway, that seems like a good stopping point. We'll take a quick break and be right back. All right, welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. Dad, let's get into best funniest lines.
All right, Dr. No. The Americans are fools. I offered my services. They refused. So did the East. Now they can both pay for their mistake. Bond. World domination, the same old dream. Our asylums are full of people who think they're Napoleon or God.
Bond, tell me, Miss Trench, do you play any other games?
Bond. Tell me, does the toppling of American missiles really compensate for having no hands?
M, if you carry a 00 number, it means you're licensed to kill, not get killed.
Hotel valet. One medium dry martini, mixed like you said, sir, and not stirred.
When did you say you had to leave? Immediately? Almost immediately?
I don't have any others.
Bond outruns a hearse full of henchmen, the three blind mice, through a construction site on a hill, causing the hearse to careen off the road and explode. How did it happen? I think they were on their way to a funeral. Dr. No, I'm a member of SPECTRE. SPECTRE? SPECTRE. Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. The four great cornerstones of power headed by the greatest brains in the world. Correction, criminal brains. The successful criminal brain is always superior. It has to be. And I can't believe you missed the obvious one. Bond, I admire your courage, Miss Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr. Bond. James Bond.
Yes.
All right, Stanley Rubric time. First up, Legacy. I'm going to go first in a rare feat, but here's the thing. I could read you back all of the stuff in the did you know or the recognition, and if you want me to, I certainly will in order to make my argument. But I don't see how this isn't a full 10. This is the longest running film franchise of all time. This is before film franchises were a thing. This thing kicks off everything else. You can basically draw a through line. While this wasn't the first spy movie, it certainly is the tentpole by which Mission Impossible, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and every other spy franchise basically draws upon going for the next 60 years. I don't really see even though this isn't the perfected formula, how it doesn't have significant industry and social culture trends. The martini, as everybody orders it, everybody knows it's shaken, not stirred. Everybody knows Bond, James Bond. A quarter of the world has seen a Bond film because this movie started everything. I give it a full 10.
I agree 100%. Just to show the level of impact. When I was a little boy, one of my favorite shows was a comedy called The Beverly Hillbillies. And the nephew, Jethro Bodine, fancied himself a 007 spy. And so he set up these strange little things to try to be a 007 spy. So it permeated into other television shows, let alone other movies. There is only one character that I would say has potentially more knowledge or success than Bond. That would be Sherlock Holmes. And I don't think that's the case anymore because he really hasn't been in films. So the last few generations are not well versed in Sherlock Holmes the way my generation was. So Bond is the most iconic fictional character, either in crime, investigation, spying, however, whatever genre you want to consider him, that I can think of. There is no parallel.
Yeah, and again, I think we've only given out a handful of tens ever in this category. No, excuse me, we've only given it out one other time. So it takes a lot to get to a 10, but given the notoriety and how many feelers it has in social culture and industry culture, and we'll repeat, a quarter of the world's population has seen at least one Bond film, and the British, I can't remember the exact one. I'd have to look back at my notes here. But the British industry basically credits this with being the backbone of all spy films for the Brits. So, just from that standpoint alone, I don't think there's too much to argue here. I think you can nitpick, but anything lower than a 9 seems frivolous to me. Certainly, the spy genre as a whole is elevated by this. So, impact significance. I'll let you go first on this one.
I went with an 8. And the reason I did this was 5 for the public, because I think the minute this film was done, a large portion of the public was clamoring for the next film. But the industry itself kind of poo pooed it. I don't think the critics really thought much of it. They thought it was kind of a panty weight type thing. So I gave that aspect of it, the industry itself, a 3, which leads to an 8. I don't think they came to appreciate the validity or the value of the Bond series and of the Bond films until much later.
It's eerie how close our scoring is because I had it exactly the same. And I really can't argue with too much of it. I think this was a cultural phenomenon, but the industry was slow to adapt through the first couple of films. So if you're just taking it on Dr. No alone, I don't know if I would say the industry impact was the same. I'll give it a 3, but I think that's more aided by the fact that you had 4 films in 4 years. So I don't think they had enough time to not react to the Bond films in totality, as opposed to now how they're spaced out every 3 to 4 years, or in this case, 6.
Thank you, COVID.
Yeah, well, or Daniel Craig's recoveries.
I'm referring to it as BC, before COVID.
Oh, that's bad. That's just bad. Novelty. I had a 7. Not the first spy film, but clearly the one that kind of changed and set up everything. Created the iconic theme song, several pieces of the Bond formula, although Goldfinger really perfected that formula. The opening title sequence of the franchise. I can't give it full points because we had a few films to go before they got to the full Bond experience. That's why Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, and Diamonds Are Forever are more rewatchable. I just kind of went with a 7. Again, it's on the way to creating the formula, but because it's not there, I can't give it full points.
I had a 7.5 because of the existence of the spy genre before. And what was novel was to create an environment that would survive and allow future films. So I gave it a little bit higher than just the novelty itself because it kind of set the foundation for future stories.
Sure. And I do think the set pieces are there, but again, they're not nearly at the peak of what the car chases and the rest of the action sequences have become, or even were in some of these films coming up. But we'll get to that here in the next couple of weeks. Classicness, what'd you have down?
Uh, I'm trying to be a little more critical of how I'm scoring these. I went with a 5.5. All right, and I apologize to the audience in advance of this. There's the male fantasy, but there's also the male reality. And the male fantasy is this would be a 10 because this is what every guy would really almost love to be. Action, save the day, have the women just crawling all over them. In reality, relationships and sex specifically is a two-way street. It has to be both consent and are on both sides. And I think sometimes Bond used his power and his position to the disadvantage of women. So if we're gonna do classicness under the guidelines we've established, I couldn't, I start with a 5, I go up or down from there. I didn't find much to go up above 5 from it.
Well, I normally start from an 8 and work backwards because there's a lot of these movies that we can usually take points of. If we're going to start at a 5 and either work up or down, that's a little bit different barometer as far as I'm concerned. But I certainly can't fault you for where you're at. But let me just say, in comparison, other films that we've scored 5.5 for classicness so far would include In the Heat of the Night. Pillow Talk got 5.67. You had Rocky, Dodgeball, and Caddyshack go at a 5.
Well,
Maybe we overscore in this category because there aren't a ton of these ones where they score awfully low, so I can adopt it. I think again, we judge the Bond films as a series and in their totality, and there are much more problematic Bond films. Notably, I would say Goldfinger scored out a 5.75 for classicness when we did that movie back. I think that was either November or October of last year. That being said, I went a little bit higher because I actually think this is pretty tame by comparison to what Bond is. Because a lot of the women either come on to him or kind of like willingly do it. And this is the part that I'm going to get at. I know that this is the Me Too era and it's about over aggressive male ego and all of these other things. But there is a grade of feminism that actually goes counterintuitive to that wants to take ownership of their sexuality, that I think would fight back against some of the problems that are supposedly in this particular movie if we just judge it by itself. So I had an 8.5. I'm willing to come down if we're just going to judge it more on a totality standpoint. Or if we're going to start at a 5, I think I could end up at like a 6. And then as a group, then we end up having a 5.75 between us for classicness, both on Goldfinger and Dr. No. But I do think that Goldfinger, due to its complications with how he forces himself on Pussy Galore, is a little bit more problematic in my mind
yeah.
than this film.
Well, for those in the show or fans of the show, they know I'm a lawyer. And when I'm looking at a case, I take my best position financially and my worst position financially, and I add them together, divide by 2, and that's my middle point. And I start from there. And then I assess how strong, what factors are favorable versus what factors are negative. And I go up or down from there. And so when I'm looking at a classicness scale, that's why I started with a 5. It's just me. I'm not saying I'm right. It's just me because 50% is the basis. It's halfway between being completely not classic and being classic. And so therefore you should start at 5 or 0.5 or 5.0 and then go up or down based on that. And that's the basis I came up with 5.5.
Forgive me, did you end up at a 5 or a 5.5?
5.5.
Okay, so splitting the difference between us, I think that ends at a 7 then overall, which I could buy in comparison to some of the other problematic Bond films. Again, I think if you're commenting on it, I think it's the essence of what the Bond character represents more than it is any one individual movie. So I'm okay with ending up sitting it there as far as that goes. But I understand the argument, and maybe we need to sort this out over the next couple of weeks. All right, so then rewatchability.
I came up with a 9. I will watch this film over and over because it's the original, and I find it. I kind of smile when certain aspects of how the Bond, James Bond, vodka martini, shaken not stirred. Those aspects just make me smile because I know what the future lies ahead. So I couldn't give it a 10 though, because in comparison to some of the other Bond films, it's a little boring. There isn't a whole lot of action. It's pretty clear cut. It doesn't take a lot of logical brain power to come up with how or what took place, or how or what the end game is and what the end solution will be. So if it's on, and there's a few things on that I would like to watch, I may very well tune in and just finish this if I'm flipping through the channels. So to that extent, I can't give it a 10, but I could give it a 9.
I went with a 9 as well. So again, really easy math because we kind of were at the hip when it comes to this one overall.
What is that math equal to, by the way?
9.
Really?
Yes, really.
Hmm.
Simply put, I've watched this film way too many times to score it too much below that because this is one of the films I probably rewatched the most in my life. Even though I have other favorite Bond films, I've probably seen some of those less than I've seen this film because it is easy and bland to rewatch, and these Connery films are on all the time. But if you told me I could sit down and watch a Connery Bond or a Daniel Craig Bond, I'm in almost every single time, regardless of which Craig film or Connery film it is. And I think this is probably the least of any of the Connery Bond films. So, I mean, there's six to choose from, and all of them are pretty good. This one just happens to be probably the most milk toast, and I have some other favorites. So, nine's pretty comfortable for where I'm sitting.
Let me put it this way. Dr. No is the early days, and Daniel Craig is the result of a long process of developing the films. And the thought process that I had when you mentioned this was I've watched NFL films where they've showed we're both Green Bay Packer owners, and I've watched old film of the Packers in the 30s and 40s with the forward pass from Cecil Isabel to Don Hudson. And while I can appreciate it for what it was and how impactful it was, I would much rather watch a pass from Aaron Rodgers to Devontae Adams now. And I think that's exactly where we are with Bond. You can appreciate the early years and for what Connery did for the character and what they did overall, but it's much more enjoyable to watch what they've been able to do with a bigger budget, more special effects, and better camera techniques with the current Bonds.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go that far. I really do enjoy certain Connery Bond films, and even Lazenby as Bond was pretty good. I have no trouble rewatching some of those. Live and Let Die or certain Roger Moore ones are pretty rewatchable. The later you go in the Roger Moore era, the Octopussies, The View to a Kills, you kind of lose me, and then you get the Timothy Dalton. But even the Pierce Brosnan ones aren't too bad. The first couple, it's just I think Craig is on a completely different level with how they're making the movies. And so it's a different experience. I can enjoy both, but for very different reasons. So let's just recap then quickly. 10 for legacy, 8 for impact significance, 7.25 for novelty, 7 for classicness, 9 for rewatchability, and an 8.5 overall for the audience score. And that leads us to a 49.75. That sandwiches it currently between E.T. and Airplane on the list.
Considering those films and their overall impact, significance, the quality of the films, I don't find that outrageous or even troubling.
I know you and I don't. I think most people would have some qualm with it, but that's the fun part about doing lists.
Well, let's put it this way: we do the show. People can agree or disagree. That's the point of doing the show. If anybody disagrees with us, email us, tweet us. Want to come on the show and evaluate another film? Do a re-evaluation of a film that we've already done. We encourage it. I mean, we're a father and son who grew up in central Wisconsin. Our views are not going to be that dissimilar, and we're broadcasting or providing a podcast which is downloaded all over the world. We don't have a patent on the quality of the show. It is subjective, and if you disagree with us, we would encourage you to tell us.
Absolutely. So, remaining questions, did you have any?
Of everything that was going on with the CIA in the early 1960s, Jack Lord playing Felix Leiter couldn't have gone into Jamaica and found the place himself? I mean, really?
Yeah, I don't exactly buy it. I mean, they do have a small argument to kind of explain that away, but it seems like in the or the Western Hemisphere, that should be American territory, not the British.
Well, and part of the whole concept is it started at Yalta, which was clearly that the British were broke. They were going to lose their empire, and they were no longer going to be the world power they had been, and they were going to be subservient to America. And America was going to be the dominant player in the last half of the 20th century. Ian Fleming wrote these in part to promote kind of a patriotic view of England in the world stage that really didn't exist.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the film. Why did the three blind mice need to pretend they were all blind all across Kingston in order to carry out the hit in one place?
Yeah, okay.
Because they show that, and it's a whole sequence of them literally playing blind all across town. It's one thing if you set up the scene, but why did they have to go all the way across town doing that?
I guess.
Number two, did we just pass over Quarrel's death too quickly? It's just like, okay, he dies at the hands of the dragon, which he was afraid of, and we have a couple of moments of wincing, and then we just move on. And he's not mentioned. Oh, excuse me. He is mentioned at the dinner scene because Bond wants to get revenge. He wants to go into the revenge part of Spectre, but it just seems like we turn the page a little too quickly on a character I'm very fond of.
That's it in the spy game, I guess.
Do you have any others?
No, not offhand.
All right, I had a couple more. What was the need for drugging the coffee when Honey and Bond first arrive? You have them already captive.
I don't know.
Wouldn't Bond be radioactive just from being around the water with the about to melt down reactor?
Yeah.
That just floors me that he doesn't have like any radioactive burns. He just kind of escapes and then goes and finds Honey and then they're fine. He's around a nuclear reactor. Anyway, and then finally the obvious question at the end of the movie. How do Honey and Bond get home if they let go of their toe?
Well, in that particular case, the ship always comes in.
Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else, just us and the microphones, and those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week, we will be continuing our James Bond celebration with Live and Let Die. Again, available in a lot of different places and may be exclusive to Prime by now. You won't want to miss that one. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram at GMOPodcast, or find Dana or I on Twitter at TJ3Duncan or at Dana W. Duncan. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.